EarthBound is super overrated and it really just doesn't have any good qualities. Right? Well, that can't be. It was a cult classic that never received the attention it deserved. We hear these opinions all the time, but which one is true, or at least more true? Well, over the years, EarthBound's reputation has certainly turned around, hasn't it? Going from being a major flop that Nintendo was so embarrassed to mention someone else had to becoming treated as a landmark work of art that is considered one of the most influential games of all time. So what changed? Well, the internet. And along with the internet came the widespread use of emulation, allowing many to be able to play it for the first time. Many more came to love and appreciate the game for what it was trying to do, and it was further showered with all the praise and attention it should have gotten when it first released, and we were all just too dumb and ignorant to see, right? Now, I absolutely love this game. But, is it possible we may have overcorrected our view a bit? The game is beloved by most, including me, and Eurogamer has even said the game is, quote, name-checked by the video game cognoscenti more than it's actually been played, and is utterly brilliant, even referring to it as a sacred cow in the gaming community. I find this particularly interesting for reasons perhaps the author didn't even intend. While most are familiar with the term sacred cow, there's an inadvertent double entendre here. Golden calf. The other side of the idiom many associate with false gods. Here's my point. Is it worthy of such praise? Are we not overlooking the problems because of how good it is, but outright ignoring them and pretending they're not there? Is it as influential as it's been praised for being? Is it overrated? Well, it'd be very easy for someone like me to just say, no, 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 but for the sake of good storytelling and intellectual integrity, I'm going to try to remove my personal feelings and experiences from this investigation. A lot of people don't like EarthBound too, so it's not like there's no condescending views of it, and I think some of these may be helpful in getting to the bottom of this question. Across many publications, there's a lot of overlap in what they praise and critique about the game, so I think it'd be helpful to look at these comment points and see if it all adds up. And these are just going to be some broad stroke ones, we're not going to get into every single thing that comes up in multiple places. Many of the common praises sung about the game include its weirdness, emotionality, scrolling HP mechanic, and music. On the flip side, many elements I've seen the most critiqued are other aspects of the battle system, some difficulty spikes, and a quote, bad story. There's some interesting duality here, don't you think? Weirdness is an interesting point of praise, I think, as it's often used as a pejorative for describing something. But here it's one of the best qualities it seems to have. Well, then why is this good weird? Well, this term is probably being used more to describe how unexpected many moments are, and how they left a pretty strong emotional impact. Which would make sense, as the emotionality of the game is another common point of the game's acclaim. This point makes a lot of sense on the face of it. We engage with art in order to have an emotional experience. If I learned just one thing through my 4 years of film school, which is what happened, it's this. Art is inherently emotional, whether its purpose is for generating a small chuckle or to irritate someone, whatever. And EarthBound's writing style has such emotionality to it, it makes sense it resonate with so many people. As obvious as it is, and as many times as you've undoubtedly heard EarthBound wasn't like other RPGs of the time, this context is important. RPGs still told emotional stories, don't get me wrong, but this was usually reserved for the dialogue, while EarthBound injects it into every single fiber of its being. You don't drop the cookie, you abandon it. You don't use the default names for the characters, you don't care what they are. But I find this to be such an interesting element to be commended when just as many people who despise the game say it has a bad story. And luckily for me, those who say this are often terrible communicators. So it's tough to narrow down what exactly is meant by this. The only attempt I've seen of someone trying to explain this critique is that the villain, Gygas, seems very sporadic and doesn't really come up until the ending. That the game just feels like essentially a bunch of disconnected vignettes, more or less. Now I could get into all about why Gygas being so ambiguous is the point, or how story structure has evolved over the course of gaming, but honestly, I think the issue with this critique comes down to the very word being used to describe it, story. There is a difference between plot and story. Plot is the literal points that the narrative is composed of, the plot points. The story is the experience the audience has getting to each one, and the emotions evoked by it. I think this point of contention is more a critique of the plot rather than the story, as it worked for many, if not more than it didn't seemingly. But believe it or not, critics are just people, and they can be swayed by their emotions just like anyone else. But isn't that the point? Isn't art supposed to get you swept up in your emotions? Well, yeah, but it's not an exact science. The emotions of a work aren't just going to resonate with everybody, and when that connection's not being made, that's when we start seeing the cracks. There certainly are times when the plot sags. It's not perfect, but I don't know, a cult to the color blue, a bizarre inverse city, an underground world of dinosaurs, this all seems boring to people? It's like, what are your standards? The plot is great, the mole caves, the monkey maze, the desert, okay yeah, I can see your point. Then there's the battle mechanics, which altogether people seem a bit mixed on. There's plenty of praise for the game's scrolling health meter, which makes for some dynamic pacing in battles, but others complain they're boring, which I think there's some truth in too. It's not the most in-depth combat system. You could seriously go the entire game without ever casting a buff or debuff and be completely fine. And for a while, the scrolling HP mechanic also isn't all that useful when your HP stat is so low towards the first part of the game, especially when you come to one of the aforementioned difficulty spikes seen throughout. So across all these arguments, they all seem to have some amount of merit to them on both sides, despite the poor communication of some of them by many. So, what conclusion does this even bring us to so far? Well, I think there's a clarification that needs to be made. There's a lot of negative connotations with the word overrated, and it can be confusing to talk about because a lot of people use it as an insult. I'm just using it to mean what it actually means, overvalued. And something can be good or even great while still being overvalued. It also comes down to what the scope of something being overrated even is. Is it overrated in the scope of being called one of the greatest games of all time? Or RPGs, or even just SNES games? And you're going to find people on both sides of these arguments. It's such a nebulous word, it's really tough to pinpoint exactly what's meant by it, but let's be honest, it's really...
Call me a killjoy, but I think that because this is not to my taste, no one else should be able to enjoy it.
It's strange, but in a sense, it's almost like success is the worst thing that can happen to something. It ends up putting a huge magnifying glass over every smudge something might have. That slogan sure turned out to be a point of contention, huh? It branches past that though, because this all very much gets at how art ages, which is a very intricate topic. Something that was groundbreaking 25 years ago and hailed as a masterpiece, more than likely now has a few faults that have shown their face more over time. But it's tough to navigate the question of how something has aged, as, in a sense, the art itself hasn't aged at all. You see, art doesn't age like milk or eggs do. It doesn't spoil. It's actually exactly the inverse, that the work has stayed the same, but everything around it has changed. Like what we might find more or less acceptable, and our overall expectations. So, how has time affected EarthBound's legacy? An important note here is that a lot of the problems people have been oh so brave to point out in recent years are nothing new in discussion of the game, and have been things people have had issues with for literally decades. Across the board though, many even seem to agree the game has aged well. In IGN's review, okay, I'm gonna cut myself off here for a moment. I do not care what you think about IGN's reviews. Do not comment telling me, bro goes to IGN for reviews, then proceed to complain when they give a game a 6. Anyway, IGN's verdict is EarthBound has aged well, and remains one of the most innovative and unique JRPG experiences around. Is this true? Well, let's take a couple things into account. First, this review was published in July 2013, which precedes a lot of notable games, even many inspired by EarthBound. This review came out before GTA 5. Second, I think it's a dangerous tightrope to compare games to others in evaluating their quality. Comparison should be drawn on for context regarding the game's place in the culture. I think this is important because, bluntly, it's easy to see why EarthBound's modern setting wouldn't be as hard-hitting to many newcomers to the game than it was in 1994. It was unique then, but in the time since we've seen tons of games take place in the modern day, including many RPGs. This doesn't devalue EarthBound's influence that paved the way for many of these titles, though. Despite this, however, EarthBound still has a sting to it. It still has a lot of shocking content for a first-party Nintendo title. The cult, the police, this. It's still pretty edgy for a game rated T, so I'd say it remains unique in that respect, and its approach to modern life, although not as unique as it was before, still breathes fresh air into what's now, ironically, a trope in its own right. For a company as established as Nintendo already was by the mid-90s, Toei was given an absurd amount of creative freedom on the project. Creative voices were really thriving there, and it's great to see that weird energy is coming back in recent games. Nonetheless, even with more outlandish games that have been released more recently, EarthBound still exudes personality that even now competes with them. I know auteur theory is pretty hotly debated in artistic circles, but it's crazy to me a toy isn't considered one in the industry up there with Miyamoto and Kojima. I get that he hasn't created nearly as many games as the two of them, but his voice shines through his work to the point where you feel like you're talking to him while playing. That even rivals the works being created in their vein even now, and continues to push the boundaries of what the medium of video games can achieve. But aside from all the personality and experimental elements, does the game still hold its own today in other aspects? EarthBound no doubt has its objectively good qualities, but it'd be a lie to suggest the game hasn't shown its age in a less flattering light too. Like I said before, the battle system is clever, but the depth isn't endless or anything. There's balancing issues and the pacing can have its lulls. I don't think these things are glossed over though. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who disagrees with such criticisms. Nothing's perfect. Maybe these shortcomings aren't the focus of people's assessments, but there's a case to be made that the way people communicate their feelings about art isn't art in itself. If you really loved a movie, you wouldn't tell your friend exclusively about every single problem you had with it, even though you knew it had its issues. You'd more likely focus on what you liked about it, and sort of proportion out your likes and dislikes about it to demonstrate overall how it made you feel. It really does make me sad to read that the game just doesn't connect with everyone, since it had such a huge impact on me, evidently. And sadly, due to how acclaimed the game is now, many are heading into it with astronomical expectations for it. But regardless if the game disappointed you or not, what's more important? That the game actually lives up to being the most X thing ever? Greatest game, greatest RPG, greatest SNES game, whatever the metric, or that the game has left such a profound impact for so long. Many things become influential, but much rarer is something that lingers for such a long time. If the game's influence only seemed to impact a few games around the same time, it'd be labeled a fad. If it impacted a few decades later, it'd be a cult classic. But the lasting effect of it can still be felt possibly even stronger 30 years removed from its release, and is even seemingly still growing. Despite the game's initial failure outside Japan, its fanbase endured and has continued to expand year after year. Clearly there's something here, right? Well, of course. A solid game. It has good music, interesting mechanics, and a one-of-a-kind experience you can't really get from anywhere else, even at other points in the series. I do, however, think that there are many pulling too hard in both directions here. Some claim the game is awful, and others overstate its quality, claiming it's flawless. Like I said, nothing can do as much damage to something's image as it becoming successful, and I think EarthBound at times has fallen victim to its own acclaim. Let's look at IGN one more time. EarthBound made its top 100 games of all time list back in 2021. Without looking, where do you think it placed? In the 70s? Or the 30s? The top 10? No. It came in at number 50, smack dab in the middle of the list. And as salty as I was at the time it didn't place higher, I think in a funny way, in the grand scheme of things, that is the most appropriate ranking it could possibly have. Not really in the upper or lower half of the list, unless you want to be a nerd, but right in between. One step further, it's ranked as number 50 of what though? The 100 greatest games of all time. That basically means this is a great game, which is where I think all around it lands. Many have laid claim it's one of, if not the, greatest game ever made. And you can see via a quick Google search it's left many puzzled, and I don't think it's necessarily because those people even really disagree, but just want to understand. It's much easier to see why certain games aren't good than why many are, but we can certainly try our best to attempt to analyze why that might be. And so many being left at a loss of why EarthBound is so beloved, again, speaks to it as a work of art. It's such an enigma of a game, there's something just so slightly off about it, but in a good way. It really does offer something that's at least somewhat indescribable, except for the fact it's unlike anything else. And I think that's why it's held in such high regard after all this time. It's left us at a loss of even how to entirely understand it. The depth of the experience seems bottomless, leading to it creeping back into our minds from time to time. Compare it to so many newer AAA games that do a majority of their storytelling through the cutscenes. You'll feel the difference. While there's games that feel nostalgic to us, that remind us of specific times of our lives, I think EarthBound raises the bar past this in a way that few games have. With how distinct a toy's voice comes across, it feels more like a person, like an old friend you're visiting. The kind of friend where no matter how long it's been since you last saw them, you can just pick up right where you left off. It doesn't do this for everyone, it's impossible for it to. But it's so profoundly touched the lives of so many since its release like this, it's easy to see why so many of its problems can be set aside. But if you didn't have that sort of experience with it and found its humor annoying, the gameplay uninteresting, and the navigation lacking, that's perfectly valid too. Now, I won't lie and say something like that can't be the player's fault.
Stop landing on those guys! You can space jump the whole f***ing room!
But it's easier if I...
No, it's not easier! You don't have to stop if you just space jump!
And I think it is sort of a responsibility for a player to give a game the attention it should if they seriously want to try to connect with it, but it's not always even just that. Sometimes someone does deeply want to enjoy something, and the experience gets soured when they realize they're not making that connection, which sours it further because now they're thinking about how they're not getting what they wanted out of it. It's a vicious cycle. But what does that make of their experience? Is their opinion void because they're now biased against it, or are they seeing things for what they really are? While the mileage on that varies from person to person, certain things seem to be clearer shortcomings to some than others, which can certainly make the game come across as a bit overrated. So, back to the thesis here. Is EarthBound overrated? Yes. Probably a bit. I should narrow down that answer a bit though. Some say people call things overrated because they just can't accept it's worthy of praise, but I don't always think it's so malicious. EarthBound is a weird game, and I don't think everyone considers that that can be just as much of an obstacle for people trying to overcome and enjoy it as the very reason people adore it. I'd say it's somewhat overrated as being crowned one of the most perfect games ever made. It seems like so many Nintendo YouTubers hype it up to these unreachable standards, that it's some work of perfection that completely decimates its contemporaries and successors, and that's not quite the case. Does it hold up? I'd say so. Is it a great game? Certainly. But in the grand scheme of things, it's a fantastic RPG that was on a console with several fantastic RPGs, and one that now shows its age a bit, but still stands out despite 30 plus years of games having been released since. And on that note, you shouldn't care if it is or isn't. You should enjoy it because of what it means to you, not because it's dubbed peak. Unless it's Mother 3. That's Kino.